Good evening, Colesburg family. Once again, I wish we could all be together. But since we can, I just want to give you a few words to think about this Wednesday evening. Last few weeks, have you felt like you're in bondage? I mean, you can't go out and eat at a restaurant. And as my wife says, takeout's just not the same. You still have to clean up. You may be among the many who can't go to work. You can't go to state parks. And while you do, at least at the moment, still have the right to assemble to worship, while following social distancing guidelines, obviously, you may feel like you're not free to do so without fear of what you may catch if you do. Well, you are essentially bound to your home, made a captive by its walls, or in some places even criminal action can be taken against you if you don't. Each week it seems like the bondage gets worse, with more restrictions being placed, more freedoms being taken away. Let me ask another question. At any point the last few weeks, have you cried out, complained, or groaned about it? Maybe you've thought or said, how much worse is it going to get? What freedom's going to be taken away next? When can we return to how it used to be? And maybe you've expressed such feelings publicly on social media to the world, maybe just in private to your spouse or family, or maybe even in private in prayer to God. If so, know that you're not the first to be in some type of bondage and groan about it. At the end of Genesis and beginning of the book of Exodus, life seems to have been pretty good for the Israelites. In Genesis chapter 45, we read in verse 11 that thanks to Joseph, they were provided for through the famine at hand. Verse 18, we read where Pharaoh told them, I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land. We read in verses 22 and 23, they had plenty clothes and food. Much like us here in America. Things were pretty well for them. But then we come into the next book, into the book of Exodus, and we read there in chapter 1, beginning verse 13, that the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with vigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage. And then we go on to chapter 2 in Exodus, and these are the main words I want us to consider this evening. We read beginning verse 23, Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out. And their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. Several things I want us to notice from this passage. Again, in Exodus 2, verses 23 through 25, if you want to follow along at home. One of the first things that we need to realize here is that God hears. God heard their groaning and their cries to him. And that's the whole reason that during this difficult time, in all times of our lives, we continue to pray to God, because we know that he hears. We could look at many passages that would remind us of that fact. God does hear. So we should keep praying to him. As his children, he wants to hear what's on our mind. And this passage also tells us that God remembers. He remembers his covenants and his promises. Just as he remembered the covenant that he had with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he remembers the promises that he's made to us. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5, we read here of one of God's promises when he says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Now, if you look in your Bibles there in Hebrews 13 and verse 5, you'll probably see some indication that this is a quote from somewhere else. Actually, the quote is taken all the way back from the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 31 and verse 6 and also verse 8, it was stated by Moses to the Israelites, and then specifically to Joshua. And then we come into the book of Joshua and we see in chapter 1 and verse 5, the Lord himself restated it to Joshua. And we find it quoted in the New Testament because it still applied to God's people then, just as it does today. God remembers his promise. He said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And that applies during this difficult time, just as it does during the good times of our lives. And we read the very next verse in Hebrews 13, verse 6. So we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? God is aware of our situation. He does remember his promise to us. So even during this time of difficulty, we can we can confidently trust in God, and we have no reason to fear, because indeed God is with us, just as he's promised to be. Also, again, going back to Exodus 2, we read that God sees. Just as he saw the Israelite in their affliction and in their time of bondage, he sees us. He's aware of what we're going through. If you can see what's going on around us, know for sure that God sees. And as the next thing that we're reminded of in that passage, closely related to God seeing, it also says that God knows. Now, the New King James says God acknowledged them. If you have the King James, it says God had respect unto them. As the New American Standard said, God took notice of them. And the NIV says God was concerned about them. Well, the ESV simply states God knew. God knows exactly what we are going through today, just as he knew exactly what they were going through then. And as it is worded in the NIV, God is concerned about our well-being. And he does respect us, and he cares for us, and he will do what is best. Now we come to Exodus 3, and we read there where God told Moses about this awareness that he had of his people, and told Moses what his plan was, what he was going to do about it. Well, chapter 4, finally and reluctantly, Moses went and revealed God's plan to the people. God wanted the people to know about his plan for them and about how he was aware of their bondage situation, about the crying and complaints and groanings they were doing to him. And after Moses went and told the Israelites what God had told him, we read in Exodus 4 and verse 31, so the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel and that he had looked on their affliction, then they bowed their heads and worshiped. Likewise, we need to believe that God is aware of our current situation, that he hears our groaning, and that he will be with us going through it. And may we respond in the same way they did, with belief, with faith in God, and instead of worrying in such times, may we worship our God instead. So I leave you with these words tonight. God is aware. He sees us. He acknowledges us. He knows what we're going through. And we can believe in that and trust his promises that he'll see us through. And don't worry. Just keep worshiping and praising his name because he is so worthy. Well, until we see each other again, until I leave another message, may God be with you and bless you.